On March 17, 1901, at Harrison's photography studio in Philadelphia, 7-year-old Grace Sullivan posed for a portrait with her father, Michael Sullivan. The picture looked like a warm family moment. A well-dressed man stood beside his young daughter, her hand resting in his, both staring seriously at the camera in the usual style of the time. Photographer Richard Harrison wrote in his studio record, "Sullivan family portrait, father and daughter, rush order, paid in advance." For 118 years, the photo stayed in the Sullivan family. It was treated as a treasured keepsake, showing Grace with the father she loved so much. Then, in 2019, digital conservator Dr. Emma Rodriguez began restoring the old photo. While zooming in closely, she noticed something that changed everything. At extremely high magnification, the image showed clear signs of something the family had never suspected. Michael Sullivan was not standing beside his daughter. He was being held upright by a hidden support stand used in that era for people who had already passed away. Grace was holding her father's hand, but he was no longer living. This is a story of how deep love and deep grief came together in Victorian photography studios, where families sometimes appear with relatives who had recently passed, and how a 7-year-old girl's final moment with her father was unknowingly preserved for more than a century. The Sullivan family always cherished the 1901 portrait. It showed Michael, age 36, dressed in a dark suit with a white shirt and black tie. Grace stood beside him in a white dress with a large bow, her small hand holding his. Both looked straight at the camera with calm, serious expressions typical of the early 1900s. According to family history, Michael had been a successful ironworker, a caring father to Grace and her younger brother Thomas, and a dedicated husband to his wife, Catherine. The story passed down through generations said the photo was taken only weeks before Michael died suddenly from what relatives believe was a heart issue at age 36. Grace later told her own children, "He was healthy one day and gone the next." I'm grateful we had that picture taken. But Grace was only 7 when she lost her father, and over the years her memory of the timing had shifted. For more than a century, no one questioned the story closely enough to notice the real timeline. In January 2019, Grace's great-great-granddaughter Sarah Mitchell reached out to the Philadelphia Historical Society for help preserving family photos. She explained that she had a beautiful but damaged portrait of her great-great-grandmother Grace with her father from 1901 and hoped it could be restored so the family could clean copies. Emma, who specialized in photos from the Victorian era, agreed to restore it. She had worked on thousands of photos from the 1800s and early 1900s, and this one seemed typical. It appeared to be a standard studio portrait with normal aging and wear. Emma scanned the photo at high resolution and zoomed in as she always did, checking for details that needed repair. At regular size, everything looked normal. Michael standing straight, Grace beside him, both looking quietly into the lens. But Emma's careful process required her to zoom in gradually at several levels. At 2,000%, she checked Grace's face. At 5,000%, she looked over the clothing. At 10,000%, she focused on Michael's face, and that is when something seemed off. His skin looked too even and too pale. At 17,000% magnification, the truth became impossible to ignore. Michael's eyes were not focused on the camera. They looked slightly past it with a flat, distant quality. Even more telling, Emma saw faint brushstrokes, showing that the eyes had been painted onto closed eyelids, a technique sometimes used in Victorian postmortem photography to make a person appear awake. Emma immediately recognized these signs. She had seen many historical postmortem photos during her career, but this image had never been labeled as one. She kept examining the picture. Michael's posture was too stiff, too perfectly straight. His hand showed no natural grip as Grace held it, and behind him, almost hidden in the dark backdrop, was a faint outline of a support stand used to keep a body upright. Michael Sullivan had already passed away when the photo was taken. His daughter had been posed beside him, creating the appearance of a simple family portrait that was actually a final farewell. Over the following week, Emma studied Victorian postmortem photography more closely, especially cases where living family members stood beside a deceased relative. She learned that this practice became more common between the late 1800s and early 1900s. In earlier decades, people who had passed were usually photographed alone. But as cameras improved, some families requested portraits with living relatives included. Many wanted a picture that made it look like the entire family was present and well, even if that was no longer the case. This was especially common for families who had lost a parent, since photos were expensive and often taken only after tragedy. The practice drew mixed opinions even back then. Some found comfort in creating one final family image. Others felt uneasy about it. But for many working-class families, it was the only chance to have a portrait taken. Timing mattered. These photos usually had to be taken within 1 or 2 days after death. Photographers used special stands, adjusted lighting, arranged clothing carefully, and sometimes painted eyes to make the person appear more lifelike. Living family members were asked to stay very still, so the whole photo looked balanced and calm. Most of these images were not labeled as postmortem because the goal was to maintain the appearance of a regular portrait. Emma also found that this practice was especially common in cities like Philadelphia, where industrial accidents sadly took many young fathers' lives. A portrait showing a father beside his children, even after his passing, became a symbol of connection and protection. Children involved in these photos often didn't know the truth. Adults typically avoided explaining what was happening, believing it would spare them distress. Grace, at 7 years old, may not have realized her father had already passed when the portrait was taken, or she might have known but not fully understood. The family belief that Michael died weeks later shows how the timeline might have shifted in Grace's mind or been softened by relatives who wanted to protect her. In 2019, the photograph finally revealed its real story. Emma documented every detail she found. At high magnification, the painting on the eyelids was clear, with smooth, perfect circles instead of the natural texture of real eyes. Michael's skin appeared too even, lacking the tiny variation seen in living skin. His posture was unusually rigid, held in place by the stand visible behind him. His hand showed no muscle tension. His clothing was arranged too perfectly, hiding marks that suggested he had already passed. Grace had been placed slightly in front of him to hide the lower part of the stand completely. Emma prepared a full report with all the evidence, and then reached out to Sarah Mitchell. "On the phone," she spoke gently. "I need to tell you something about your family photograph," she said. "The man in the picture, your great-great-great-grandfather, Michael, was no longer living when the portrait was taken. This is actually a Victorian postmortem photograph." Emma explained the situation as gently as she could. Your great-great-grandmother Grace was being posed next to her father's body. There was a long pause before Sarah finally responded. "That can't be right. Our family always said he died weeks after the picture." Grace said it was one of the last times she saw him looking healthy. "I understand," Emma replied, "but the photo tells a different story. Once we compare the date of the portrait with the actual date of Michael's death, I'm certain we'll see the timeline was remembered differently or that Grace was told something meant to comfort her." Sarah agreed to let Emma look deeper into the records. Emma started with death certificates from Philadelphia in early 1901 and found Michael Sullivan's information quickly. He had died on March 15, 1901, at age 36, after an industrial accident where heavy iron beams crushed his chest. He was listed as an iron worker and survived by his wife, Catherine, and their 2 young children, Grace and Thomas. Emma checked the studio ledger again. It showed the portrait taken on March 17, 1901. That meant only 2 days passed between Michael's death and the photograph. Grace never stood beside her living father. She stood beside his body. Newspaper archives added more details. A short article from March 16, 1901, confirmed that Michael had been killed at the Cramp Shipbuilding Company when a load of iron shifted and struck him. It mentioned he was respected at work and that he left behind his wife and children. The funeral was scheduled for March 18th, the day after the photograph. Emma now understood what Catherine had done. Newly widowed and trying to support 2 children, she wanted Grace to have something to remember her father by. Portraits were expensive, and the family could not afford one when Michael was alive. After his death, Catherine likely borrowed money or sold belongings so she could pay for one precious picture. On March 17th, she brought Grace and Michael's prepared body to the studio. The photographer, Richard Harrison, had experience with these kinds of portraits. He positioned Michael using a support stand, arranged his clothing, touched up his eyes, and guided Grace into place so the photo would look natural. Grace, at 7, may have known her father had passed, or she may not have fully understood. At that time, children were often present at wakes and familiar with seeing relatives after death. Over the years, it seems her memory blurred, or her mother softened the truth to protect her. For more than a century, the photograph had been treated as a sweet portrait taken before tragedy. But Emma's research showed it was a memorial image created after Michael's passing, made by a mother who wanted her daughter to have something lasting. Emma continued researching Grace's life. Grace lived from 1894 to 1982, married at 19, raised 5 children, and spent her life working and caring for her family. Through Sarah, Emma gained access to old letters, diaries, and recorded interview Grace made in 1978 for a local history project. Emma listened carefully to the old recording. Grace recalled her father with affection. She talked about the day of the accident, saying she remembered going to a photographer because her mother said they needed a picture of the two of them. She described wearing her white dress with the large bow and standing next to her father. She said he didn't talk that day, and her mother told her he was simply staying still for camera. Grace said her mother kept the picture on the mantel her entire childhood, reminding her to remember her father. Grace admitted she barely remembered his voice or how it felt when he lifted her, but she remembered standing in that studio, trying to hold still. Emma finished the recording in silence. Everything matched what she had uncovered. Grace described the moment as a portrait session, not as posing with someone who had passed. Her memory had softened over time, or she may never have known the full truth. Catherine's intentions also became clearer. Whether she explained the situation to her daughter or protected her with a simple story, she wanted Grace to grow up with something that connected her to her father. Grace kept the photo for the rest of her life. When Catherine passed away, Grace inherited it and later showed it proudly to her own children, believing it was taken shortly before her father died. The photograph moved through 4 generations until it reached Sarah, with none of them knowing its true origin. When Emma presented everything to Sarah in 2019, Sarah was shaken. She held his hand. She said, quietly, she was only 7. Yes, Emma said softly, but it wasn't done out of harm. It was done out of love. Catherine had nothing and wanted to give Grace at least one image of her father. This was the only way she could do that at the time. Emma explained how difficult life was for widows in 1901, how expensive portraits were, and how important even a single photograph could be. Slowly, Sarah began seeing the portrait differently. The image was not something dark. It was a mother trying to give her daughter something she would treasure. Later that year, the Philadelphia Historical Society created an exhibition called Hidden in Plain Sight, Victorian Memorial Photography. The Sullivan portrait became the feature piece, presented with Emma's research, the death records, the news article, and the recording of Grace's memories. The exhibit drew wide attention, not for shock value, but because it showed how families in the past cope with loss and try to preserve connection. At the opening, Sarah spoke about the photo. She said she had been shocked at first, but then realized her great-great-grandmother Catherine had done the only thing she could. She had no money and no photos of her husband, but she found a way to give Grace something to hold on to. Sarah said the picture represented love, loss, and a family's effort to stay connected. The photo now remains on display with an explanation of its history, noting that it shows Grace with her father 2 days after he passed. It explains how families sometimes pose with loved ones who had died, so that they could have a portrait that otherwise wouldn't exist. It mentions that Grace treasured the photo for 75 years, and that her family kept it for nearly 12 decades before learning its story. Grace lived a long life. Her obituary mentioned her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, her work, and her kindness. It also mentioned that she lost her father at age 7 and treasured a photograph of the two of them. Grace never knew the truth behind that portrait. She believed it showed her with her living father. In some ways, that may have been a gift. What the photograph preserved was not the moment itself, but the love she felt. Michael Sullivan passed away on March 15th, 1901. 2 days later, his body was placed in the studio so his daughter could have one final moment to hold on to. The photo captured her standing beside him, holding his hand, creating the memory she would keep for the rest of her life. He didn't get to watch her grow up, walk her down the aisle, or meet her children. But through that single photograph, taken only days after his passing, he remained with her. Even after 118 years, that love is still visible. Grace's portrait is now part of the Philadelphia Historical Society's collection, helping people learn about how families preserve memories in the past. The story of Grace and Michael Sullivan leaves us with a powerful reminder of how families try to hold on to people they love, even when life takes them too soon. For more than a century, the photograph passed quietly from one generation to the next, treated as a sweet moment between a father and daughter. No one questioned it, and no one imagined it carried a deeper truth. Yet when the truth finally surfaced, it did not erase the meaning the photo had always held. If anything, it made the image even more moving. Grace spent her entire life believing she had stood next to her father while he was still alive. That belief shaped how she remembered him, how she talked about him, and how she shared the photograph with her children and grandchildren. Even without knowing the full story, she kept the portrait close because it represented her father's presence in her life. It reminded her that she had been loved and that he had been part of her world, even if for a short time. What Catherine did in 1901 was an act of love under circumstances that were incredibly hard. She faced the sudden loss of her husband, the demands of caring for 2 young children, and the financial struggles that came with widowhood. Yet she still found a way to give Grace something she could cherish for the rest of her days. The portrait was not about hiding the truth. It was about giving a child a lasting connection to the father she adored. When Emma uncovered the real history behind the image, she didn't take anything away from the family. Instead, she helped them see how strong the bond in that portrait truly was. The photograph is no longer just a keepsake. It has become a window into how families at the time showed love, honored memories, and tried to protect their children. Today, the portrait stands not only as a historical example of Victorian memorial photography, but also as a personal story of a family whose love lasted more than a century. It shows how one moment, captured with care and intention, can carry meaning far beyond what anyone at the time could have imagined. In the end, the photograph remains what it always was: a mother giving her daughter one final moment with her father, and a daughter holding on to that moment for the rest of her life. And now, as the photograph sits on display for visitors to see, it continues to do what it always did. It honors a father who worked hard for his family, a mother who did everything she could in a devastating moment, and a little girl who carried that memory for the rest of her life. People who view the portrait today don't see something frightening. They see a family holding on to each other in the only way they could. More than a century later, the simple act of taking that photograph still speaks clearly. Love mattered then, and it still matters now.